The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. There is a new debate inside the hashtag Never Trump movement about how to respond to a president that the Never Trump movement really doesn't like, but a Republican Party that overall does seem to like him. And there are increasingly some Never Trump conservatives. Like, for example, New York Times columnist David Brooks is a conservative, but he is a Never Trumper. Former Bush White House aide Reed Galen, they are having a debate about what to do when it comes to sort of the inability to really make a dent in Republican support for Trump, because Republicans still generally really like Trump, according to just about every poll that we've seen. And one idea is to leave the Republican Party and create a third party. We know, based on the same reasons that prevent third parties on the left from being successful would likely prevent third parties on the right from being successful. There are other conservatives like George Will and Max Boot who have become registered independents, or depending on what state you're in, it's just called unregistered or unaffiliated. And they are actually urging voters to put Democrats in charge of Congress this November. They're not saying become Democrats necessarily, but they're saying leave the Republican Party to show that people are deregistering. In this particular election, put Democrats, vote for Democrats as a sort of stopgap measure, and allow, hopefully, the Republican Party to realize that this is absolutely disastrous, what's going on under Trump, and see if they kind of go back to their senses. But according to speculation reported by Politico, former McCain 2008 chief strategist Steve Schmidt, who's been extraordinarily vocal on social media and in broadcast media against Donald Trump, he is actually thinking about signing up to work with or for or to support an actual Democratic presidential candidate in 2020, including possibly Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz. And this would be considered extraordinarily opportunist. Schmidt would probably make a lot of money as the Republican strategist who says he's going to work for a Democrat in 2020. But there is a question here, Pat, about what is the principled move if you're a Republican who doesn't like Trump, but also what's the pragmatic move. And I don't really care about giving Republicans advice, but it's interesting that Trump has so shaken some elements of the Republican Party, small elements, but they're there, that they're actually thinking about not only voting for Democrats, but even working for Democrats in 2018 and 2020.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly happy that more Republicans are considering voting for Democrats, because at the end of the day, that helps our side. I just think it's kind of a curious strategy on their part, because I think you win by winning. I remember, like, in 2012 when Obama was going up against Romney, there were some progressives out there saying that you should actually support Romney because Obama isn't really the guy that we were all promised. He's not a true progressive champion. And having Romney in there would wake up the left, and it would cause this progressive resurgence to happen. And then Democrats could win over in 2016, and we could get some real liberals in there. I mean, obviously that didn't turn out. I don't think that strategy would have worked. Now, of course, we have a conservative everything, right? We have a conservative White House and a conservative House and Senate, and maybe we do see a blue wave coming, but it's hard to think that far out, and you kind of have to make those short-term wins, I think, and that's how you gain majorities, that's how you spread your influence, and, you know, it create a larger impact over a longer period of time.
Sure, but from a pragmatic standpoint, if the Republicans that they could vote for in 2018 are committed Trumpists, how is that even a step in an anti-Trump direction? If anything, it only sort of further reinforces Donald Trump's support in the House and Senate to run for re-election in 2020. I mean, there were some on the left, I'm not going to name them, but even media people on the left who said, I want Trump to win instead of Hillary, because Hillary would be a disaster and Trump also will be a disaster, and it might lead to an actual leftist revolution of some kind. And in the first 6 to 12 months of Trump's presidency, it seemed like that was going to be the case. Now we see that voter enthusiasm has sort of waned. We see that the sort of math of who's up for re-election in the Senate in 2018 doesn't really favor Democrats. That strategy was one that was mentioned by a lot of people on the left, and it already seems to be failing, although I guess we still have to count the votes in November of 2018. I just don't know if it's good strategy.
Yeah, because it's risky, right? I mean, there's no guarantee, and I think this Never Trump thing has been going on for a long time, but the numbers are shrinking in size and scope. There are fewer and fewer of these Never Trumpers remaining. There still are those Republicans out there who don't like how he acts. They think he's too indecent. They think that his trade policies are disastrous, and so they don't really have a home. And I think that's why you see so many more of them defecting from the Republican Party. The third party thing is not a good option. I'd be happy with them voting for Democrats. Certainly, I don't want them to take over the Democratic Party because we're trying to move away from the establishment centrist wing by and large and move over to the more progressive wing and have people like Bernie Sanders run the party. But hey, you gotta get the majority somehow.
Yeah, I mean, if moderate Republicans come over to the Democratic Party, that is going to not be what we want in the Democratic Party, big picture. One other thing, really important, it's really good to remember not to romanticize the never Trump conservatives as allies of progressivism. They're just slightly sane enough to realize that Trump is a disaster, but they're not actually our allies. There's this sort of enemy of my enemy is my friend thing that might work like for 2018, maybe, but long term, these are not our political allies. One of the promises that Kim Jong-un made after that infamous Trump-Singapore summit was that the remains of Americans who died in the Korean War would start to be returned to the United States. One of the real questions was whether those remains actually still exist. Some purported remains of Americans who died in the Korean War have arrived in Hawaii. They were escorted in a ceremony 65 years after the conflict ended. And of course, now the question is, are these really the remains of Americans? We don't know the answer. They are going to be analyzed. At this point, I wonder, and I don't want to devalue what the families of these deceased service members want or believe that will be good for them. I just sort of genuinely wonder, Pat, does this really provide closure? I don't know the answer to that. I'm genuinely asking it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if there was a military death in the family like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, getting the remains back would provide some closure. But, the Korean War was over 60 years ago, something like 65 years ago, the ceasefire happened. So I don't know. If you didn't get closure by this point, you're probably never going to get it at all. And just getting the remains, which at this point are probably bones in a coffin that is going to be buried, I don't think that's going to do much for you.
Yeah, I mean, if it is, I'm not saying this is worthless, right? So if this is important, then that's fantastic, and hopefully there's some way. I don't know about the science of it. Hopefully there's a way to identify whose remains these actually are. I just think it's really important not to be tricked into thinking that this is a political success, bigger picture, if the one thing Kim Jong-un does keep his word on is the returns of the remains, because that doesn't actually change the broader sort of nuclear and militaristic aggression questions that are there. Not much else to say about it other than I am curious to ultimately see, number one, what can we determine about these remains? And number two, what does this do for the families of those service members?
I think it would be such a minor win if it turns out that they actually are the deceased soldiers, especially because out of the summit we were hoping to get something like the reduction of nuclear weapons, something like peace, something like having fewer and fewer North Koreans starving to death because of the actions of their government. So it would be just such a small victory and such a small thing to get out of this summit.
Yeah, and it's, again, not to say that it wouldn't be significant for those families, for sure. But geopolitically, I tend to agree with you. Capital gains. Capital gains tax rates have been sort of a political football for a while. Democrats tend to want the capital gains taxes, meaning gains on investments on passive income, to be a little higher. Republicans tend to want them to be lower. And the Donald Trump administration is now looking at yet another tax cut, and this would be one specifically to capital gains. And the way it would work is that it would inflation index or inflation adjust the cost basis for an investment that you then sell. So let me give you an example. If 10 years ago you buy $1,000 worth of stock, and today you sell it for $5,000, you take $5,000 minus the $1,000 you paid, that's $4,000. You pay capital gains on the $4,000. What the Trump administration wants to do is inflation adjust the $1,000. The $1,000 you invested in the stock 5 years ago is equivalent to, call it, $1,500 in today's dollars. So therefore, you would not pay capital gains on 5,000 minus 1,000. You would pay capital gains on 5,000 minus 1,500, which is what that $1,000 would have been worth today. That can reduce your tax liability on capital gains significantly. Is this a crazy idea in principle? It's not. The problem is, it's arbitrary to say this is what we are going to inflation adjust rather than other things. Like if you said we're going to just do inflation adjustment, period, on a whole bunch of different measures that impact tax liability, then you might have an argument to say, okay, right, well, so inflation exists and we should account for inflation when thinking about the taxes people have to pay. Inflation adjusting the cost basis for capital gains disproportionately goes to the very, very, very rich. And there's been different analyses done about this and who it will benefit. And depending on which one you look at, the disproportionate, 75% of the benefits will go to the top 1% or 2%. 50% of the benefits will go just to like the top 0.1%. So I think that there is a defendable logic behind doing the inflation adjustment. There's also good arguments not to do it. But to cherry pick this is literally just a cash handout to the very, very rich, Pat. And it's not surprising because that's who Trump is, and that's who is in Trump's cabinet, and that's who Trump's friends are. And these are the types of handouts that anybody could have predicted, and they're coming true.
Yeah, and I think Trump administration officials and Republicans in general, they can kind of sense that there's a blue wave coming, or at least that there may be a blue wave coming. And if they're able to take back the House of Representatives, if that turns blue in 2018 during the midterms, they're not going to be able to do this stuff anymore. I mean, they got away with the Trump tax cuts in February of this year. That was a giant handout to the very wealthy and to corporations because, of course, those are permanent, whereas the tax cuts on the middle class expire after just a few years. This is the last thing they can do. They can sense that the store is closing, and this is their last opportunity to raid it.
Yeah, it may be, although there are actually some reports that some of these new ideas might not be done through the same type of legislation. And there are some sort of like tricky legislative ways in which this could be done unilaterally, or I guess without the support of the House and Senate. And that actually is even scarier. I think that certainly what might happen in November would be some pressure for the Trump administration to maybe try to move on some of these ideas. But there's even discussions going on about skipping the traditional process and passing some narrow executive orders that could have the same impact. That is extraordinarily scary, although the upside to that would be it could be reversed by the next president relatively easily. I am in New Orleans for Netroots Nation. I will be here today. I will also be here tomorrow. And maybe on tomorrow's bonus show, I'll tell you a little bit about what's been going on here.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.